afternoon, everyone. I pray this has been a wonderful, glorious Sunday as we take a respite from our Lenten disciplines, long enough for us to be refreshed by some new information, some enticing information for us as women and men, but particularly because this is Women's History Month, I want to welcome you all to this afternoon's presentation of Practical Audacity, Black Women and International Human Rights, which is the story of Black women in the U.S. and in Africa who were social justice warriors, focusing their attention on specific issues that impacted their communities. Please allow me to share just a few logistical norms that will govern our time together. Unless you're one of the panelists or otherwise instructed, we ask all attendees to please put your devices on mute. As our presentation unfolds, please add your questions and comments to the chat box. You get a thought, put it in the chat box. And that way we'll be able to capture that thought and respond to thoughts and questions by the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available later on UBE's YouTube page and website. As is our custom, we begin our time together with prayer. Let us pray. And this particular prayer is abstracted from A Prayer for Writers by Carmen Joy Imes. Author and Word of Life, you have spoken with clarity, grace, and power. Your creative word set into motion the universe. You have moved upon men and women through the ages to announce your word to your people and pass it on to subsequent generations. And you have made us in your image to carry on your creative work, to bring order to ideas by noticing and naming what is true. Thank you for the joy of creative participation in this world that you've made. Help all writers to articulate truth beautifully, precisely, and lovingly. May they not be so enamored with the sound of their words that they neglect sound content. Enable them to present these ideas in a winsome way that does justice to their importance. In a world full of distractions, help them focus on the task to which you have called them. And grant, dear Lord, open eyes, ears, and hearts of all who will read their words. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Our panelist and guest author today is Dr. Stanley M. James, a graduate of Spelman College, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and the Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver. After a long and successful teaching career at various colleges and universities, Dr. James retired from Arizona State University, where she was serving as the Vice Provost of Community Engagement and Inclusion. Her areas of expertise include Black feminism, Black women's studies, and women's international human rights. Stanley is a lifelong Episcopalian and is a member of the Church of the Epiphany in Tempe, Arizona. She is serving a second term on the Standing Committee of the Diocese of Arizona. She is a member of the Arizona chapter of UBE. We welcome you, Dr. James.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
It is a blessing to have you. And I now turn the program over to you and ask that you begin by telling us about your book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, as you heard, The book is called Practical Audacity, and it is about Black women who do international human rights. I met one of the people who are featured in the book um, some years ago when I was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She was a person who was an activist. And at that time, the university had a program where they invited activists to come and spend a couple of weeks at the university so that they would have time to rest and recuperate from, all of their labors. And they asked me or invited me to come and meet her and have a meal, take her out for a meal. And so we got to talking, and she was telling me about the work that she did and or was doing, and I was just like amazed about all of the things that she had done and was doing. But she also talked about it in terms of international human rights, which was an area of interest for me, especially women's international human rights. And as we talked, I was asking her, was she aware of other people who were doing this work? And she said, oh, yeah, there's so and so doing this and so doing that, and so forth and so on. And I thought, you know, I nobody is talking about them. We haven't heard about them. We have been focused on um, finally retrieving the stories of Black women who were doing the civil rights work. You know, we finally got past the old story that Rosa Parks just got tired one day on the bus and her feet were sore, and that's how she, started the Montgomery bus boycott. But what we didn't know that she had spent, I don't know, 10, 20 years in the fields of Alabama, um, working with the NAACP to collect the stories of women who had been raped and who had no place to go to report it and to seek redress from the legal system in Alabama. So she was busy collecting their stories, working with them, protecting them, helping them through the trauma of that. And we never heard anything about it. All we heard about was her tired feet. So I knew that scholars were doing this work, were unearthing this work, but I also knew that we were coming into the 21st century and that some people had decided that the struggle for civil and political rights was not actually um, resolving the complicated issues of oppression that we were suffering from. And they were looking for another sort of umbrella under which they could do the kind of work that addressed the interrelated, what I call the family of isms: racism, sexism, um, homophobia, classism, disability, problems with for the disabled, all of those people. And it needed to recognize that we as human beings are more than one kind of person. We have identities that include any number of things. Um, we're getting old, so we're going to face ageism, for example. We may be Black, we may be female, you know, we may be lower class or working class, but we also could be getting old, and there's things that we need to address and that we need to, as a group, address to try to make this a better place and a better world. So, what I wanted to do was to go out and see if I could interview and talk to these women about the ways that they were addressing these kinds of difficult issues through under the umbrella of international human rights. So I found about 14 women. There were more than that, but I collected the stories of 14 women. I went to the, oh, let me back up and say, I wrote to the Ford Foundation and told them that I was interested in doing this project. And I don't think I heard from them at all for about 18 months. And then all of a sudden, I get a telephone call in my office, and the woman, her name was Barbara Phillips, said, Stanley James, I got this proposal on my desk. How much money do you want to do this? And I'm like, 'cause I was just shocked. So I said, well, let me think about it, and can I call you back? So I immediately called up one of my colleagues who got grants all of the time. And I said, how much should I ask? I'm thinking about this. She said, oh, girl, that's not enough. And so she told me how much to ask for. And I asked for it, and they gave it to me. And so I was able to travel around the country and to various spots in around the world to sit with these women and interview them about what they were doing and to see it. I could go and visit their places of business, shall we say, or where they were conducting their business and see how it looked, and then write about them. And I tried to write it in such a way that it provided their stories, but their stories were contextualized into why was it necessary for them to do this? How did they decide that this was the thing that I want to do or I want to devote my life to? Um, and what is the history behind it? How does a society address it? And why do they see the need that they have to come in and make those changes? So they are practical and they are audacious and they are absolutely committed to um, to conceiving and implementing international human rights. I don't know if you have another question you want to ask, or if I could talk forever.
Well, I think that's excellent. And I appreciate you for that because it is a fantastic introduction. So you said there's 14 women
Mhm.
that you interviewed, out of many more, but you were able to connect with those 14. Can you tell us a little bit about who they are? And
Yeah, I interviewed more, but
okay,
it's 14 women that were in the book. So we have there, I kind of divided them up into different kinds of things, but Adrienne Wing, Lisa Crooms, now Robinson, Hope Lewis, and Catherine Powell. All of them are law professors in the academy, but all of them also had been activists prior to, their work as within the profession. And so they come to the law schools that they teach in with this background,
yes,
that they have practiced law. So their stories and their stories are all different, you know, and they focus on different kinds of things. So I talk about their backstories and then what they're doing and how they're, affecting change within their various law schools. Um, Two women that a lot of these women nobody ever heard of. And that's a crying shame. The next two were Judge Gabriel Kirk McDonald and Patricia Vizier Sellers. And I had to go to The Hague in the Netherlands to interview them because they were involved in the International Tribunal on the um, well, they did two international communal com, uh, let me see if I can get my mouth untangled. But um, they worked for the work on the former Yugoslavia,
Mhm.
and Rwanda. You remember there were these terrible wars that went on in those countries. And so the UN set up these international tribunals to study it and also to figure out ways to bring the people who were engaged in uh, 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 genocides
Mm.
to justice. So Gabriel Kirk MacDonald had been a civil rights lawyer in the South, and she worked with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund um, in the 60s. And then she was appointed as one of the first Black women judges in the district court in Texas, of all places. And so she did that for 10 or 12 years. And then she went on to be a professor in the Thurgood Marshall Law School at Texas Southern. And then, as she says, she was kind of connected to the old boy network, and they were looking for someone to uh, uh, to present to the United Nations
Mhm.
as a judge that could go and sit on the tribunals for these two things. And the UN, she said that once the Africans found out she was a sister and she had civil rights creds, they hurried up and voted for her. And so she went over there and she was the first African American to
Yeah.
serve on this tribunal. And she was eventually elected president to be on this tribunal. And she went, now this is, I love this about these women. Once she got the nod that she was going to get the job, people came from the UN um, to work with her to help her put together in Texas to put together the rules of law of how this court should operate. So she gets there, and actually, they didn't even have chambers. They had nothing in The
Wow.
Hague. They had not set this court up. They didn't have rules of how they would operate. And she walked in, and when she met with those first judges, she said, "Here's some rules of operation."
Yeah.
And they took them and re put them together and added here and there, and that's how it started. And then she also was involved with going someplace to find a building where they could actually have court. So, I mean, she literally was on the foundation of these two tribunals. Um, Patricia is a lawyer, had a long career, or quite a illustrious career, uh, but decided that she wanted to do this international law stuff, and particularly this. So she went over there and said to Gabriel, um, "Are you hiring law clerks? Because I'll be your law clerk." And they hadn't even thought about that. They hadn't done that. So instead, they put her in the prosecutor's office for this court. So between the two of them, what they did was to take, okay, the law that, international law that uh, we have laws for is
Mhm.
called humanitarian law. And you are familiar with them probably as you've heard of the Geneva Conventions. Okay.
Yes. Mhm.
So what they're doing is trying to use the Geneva Conventions to try these people who may have committed war crimes. Okay.
Okay.
But the thing that's interesting is that they also were trying to connect it to international human rights.
Mm.
The
Mhm.
difference is that humanitarian law is designed for country to country.
Mhm.
Okay. So individuals are not included usually in international law anyway.
Yeah.
Only in international human rights does the individual come into being, shall we say,
Mhm,
within
mhm,
international
mhm,
human rights.
mhm.
So, what they were doing in their work was connecting humanitarian law and international human rights. And so, this was the first place, because they didn't do it in Japan or in Germany after those wars. But this is the first place where they constructed the law that says that rape is a practice of genocide and it is a war crime. Never before in under international law had that been the case. Okay. So they were prosecuting these criminals that they managed to get arrested in these countries under this new conceptualization of what constitutes a war crime.
Yes.
And, they said rape was a war crime and it was a practice of genocide.
Mhm.
Okay. And that has now been taken up in the criminal court. They're using the law that they established in the criminal court in Rome now.
Yeah.
These are two black women who are
Yeah.
doing this work, and I'm like, how come don't nobody know about this?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
so we had them, then we had Aisha Imam and Loretta Ross were in the next chapter, and I'll talk about Loretta later. But um, Aisha Imam is a Nigerian woman who had developed at the local level and then out to the throughout the Islamic world. uh, she developed organizations that were seeking to uh, understand the role of women in Islam. They say things like, well, in Islam, women can't do this, that, and the other. And, the imams are saying that. And they, studied the Quran and they said, no, it doesn't say that. You know, it doesn't say that we have to be secluded, for example. It doesn't say that we have to wear the hijab, you
Right.
know.
Right.
Um, but part of what they said was, if that was the case, how come, they're not doing certain things like this in different parts of
Uh,
the Islamic world?
uh,
So in Nigeria and in the other parts of Africa, they were practicing female genital cutting, and they said it was Islamic. They studied that and they said, mm-mm, they ain't doing it in Saudi Arabia, you
mhm.
know. So no, these are things that have come up in, well, the practice of female genital cutting was was there before Islam swept across Africa.
Yes.
So
Yes.
what they decided to do was to just say, okay, well, since the people are already doing that and we're trying to get them under our control, we won't fight with them about that,
Uh,
so long as they, succumb to what we need to have done. But at any rate, she did the work on, looking at the Quran and finding out what it actually says. And there's a lot of things in there that exist to protect the rights of women
mm.
that are not talked about, in these countries that have um, adopted Sharia law. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So anyway, she did that. Loretta Ross has done everything.
Uh-huh.
I mean, she's amazing. But one of the things that she did was to establish a human rights uh, program in Georgia. Okay. And one of the things you should know about international human rights is that Americans were involved in saying we needed them and helping to. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the committee that wrote the UN Declaration on Human Rights. You know, so, but our actually the way that we deal with human rights is we think that it's important for all them countries over there to have human rights. But we don't read it, we don't need them here because we already got our Constitution, and it's like the Bible. And so what are you talking about? You know, I once had the opportunity to talk to Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor. And so I asked her, I said, what does the Supreme Court think about international human rights? Do you use international human rights in any of your, decisions or as underpinnings for your decisions? She said, no. I mean, it
Yeah,
wasn't even a discussion.
yeah.
Okay. So we're very good at telling other people what they need to do, but we don't see the need for doing it here in our country.
Mm,
And these women were saying, no, what we are doing here, the civil rights is not covering what we need to have done or taken care of. And no, we're not doing that. So those two, Loretta is doing her own thing, and she's amazing. She's been named a MacArthur Genius. So, a couple of
job.
years ago. Then we got Linda Burnham, Dazone Dixon Diallo, and Jaribu Hill. Linda was in California. Dazone was in Atlanta, and Jaribu was in the Mississippi Delta, of all
Okay.
places. I said, that's the last place you would think there was a movement for human rights or workers' rights, and the place that probably needed it the most, you know. But they're doing amazing things there. Dayzone, she discovered, well, she has a long backstory, which I won't go into, but what she got involved with was uh, AIDS and its impact on Black women. So you remember there was a time in I would say in the 90s, 2000 odds, where Black women were coming down with AIDS. And they were not telling anybody, they were keeping it a secret because many of them were engaged, they're involved in Black churches where they knew that if they got AIDS, they would be shunned. And they also were married or had relationships with Black men. And they often were relationships that were um, fraught, shall we say. There was a lot of physical violence. So if you said that, you gave me AIDS or that kind of thing, uh, then they could, theoretically be killed, or certainly beaten up. So they kept it to themselves
Mm,
for many years before they would, finally say what it was that was going on. But what she discovered was that while the CDC in Atlanta had a protocol for the way that AIDS presented and how you should address it, the protocol was focused on gay men.
mm,
And the way that African American women and other women present AIDS is very different than the way it presents in gay men. And so they fought. Once they realized there was difference, they fought with the CDC to change what their protocol was so that it was inclusive of what was happening with women. Meanwhile, she had these women who had been, for whatever reason, often were homeless or kicked out of their homes or their families. They were shunned by their families and their churches and so forth and so on. And sometimes they had kids. So she established a, an housing program for
mm,
these women so that they would have a safe place to go. But meanwhile, they also would be learning about how to address their sexuality, and what to do about, uh, being able to talk about it and to be able to establish, if you were going to do this, relationships that were healthy. Um, They also learned how to advocate at city council for their needs, for all kinds of things. So it grew into quite a program, still exists today. And she even took it to South Africa because South Africa, if you might recall, they were suffering an epidemic of AIDS. And so they had a program down there as well. So Cerebral Hill, excuse me, in Mississippi in the Delta was working on workers' rights, because workers were catching hell, basically. Um, the laborers, working for, these companies, um, and like working for the women that were working in the catfish industry, and the horrible things that they were doing to them, like, having them standing around in water all day, not letting them have bathroom breaks, um, and taking all the doors off the bathrooms, and the men coming in standing over them if and when they had an opportunity to go to the bathroom, just horrendous stuff. And so they had been working on getting workers their rights, and, just basic human rights,
Right.
you know. So there was that. And then Philomena Chioma Steady has done a lot of work with the UN. Barbara Phillips was the woman who was at the Ford Foundation, and she worked to make sure that the Ford Foundation uh, recognized that there was such a thing as international human rights, and to set up making sure that people got funding to do the work. And she's the one that called me up and asked me, did I want to do this work? And she had this money for me. But she did a lot at the Ford Foundation to help them to recognize that there were women of color that needed to be supported in this kind of work. And then the last one, who's the other um, um, MacArthur uh, uh, Genius winner, is Gay McDougall. And she is just absolutely amazing as well. And one of the things that we knew her for was she was working to uh, get rid of apartheid in South Africa. Okay. Now, her work was so amazing that she was banned from going to South Africa, because you know she was raising money, and she was helping the leadership of the anti-apartheid movement to direct strategies on
Mhm.
how they would approach this, or what they would do to get this stopped. And so she tells a story about one time going to, I think it was Lesotho or someplace like that. It's one of those little countries in southern Africa where you have to go to Johannesburg and then fly from there to the country. They don't have a direct route for you to fly into this country. And so she 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 was going to this country, and she had to fly through South Africa, and she wanted to see whether or not, she could, actually get through. When she gets there, and she's a little tiny woman, and she said she's going through customs, and they're looking at her, and they're saying, "You're Gay McDougall? You're the one that your file is horrendous. You got this big file, and you may not leave the airport. And we have assigned a man to be with you, because her flight wasn't, she came in that night and her flight wasn't leaving until the next day,
Uh-huh.
who sat with her in the airport to make sure that she didn't get let loose in the country." So she was amazing. And then once apartheid was, dismantled, they had to work to set up the Constitution. And she worked with them she was a lawyer as well, to do the Constitution, and also to set up the first all parties election, or all race election, that they were going to have, the one where Nelson Mandela was Nelson Mandela became president, and I have the only picture in here is a picture of her standing next to Nelson Mandela as he is dropping his ballot in the first time he ever voted. So those are the ladies, and I'm only giving you a kind of a bird's eye view of who they are. But
You having a wonderful view. Amazing. First of all, we're always looking for 21st century leaders, new names, new faces, and being able to celebrate the work that continues to be done. And
mhm,
so often it feels like there's a dearth there. Where can I find, a
mhm,
mentor? Where can I find a model? So your book in and of itself is presenting to this generation, a whole slate of women that are
mhm,
actively doing the work of social justice. What do we call them? Warriors
mhm,
of social justice warriors, and
mhm.
doing it quite well. Now, one of the people who is present has asked a question about Diallo. Is it Q Dazan Diallo
Is it?
as a name? Diallo,
Yes. Yeah.
Diallo,
Yes.
and
Yes.
wonder whether or not you could talk a little bit about what characteristics set a center woman apart, a center woman.
Okay. So Day Zone is interesting. And by the way, if you go through the Atlanta airport, I don't know if it's still up, but they had a list of notable people in Atlanta, that you should know. These are they're important people in Atlanta. And I'm walking through the airport, and her picture is up there, you know. So which I thought was wonderful, to see that. But anyway, what I would say about her, she's interesting because she's my Spelman sister.
Ah, okay.
Okay. She went to Spelman, years after me,
Mhm.
and she went after the civil rights movement. So she talks about the fact that she, and that's the other thing is that a lot of these women are young enough until they would not have been involved in the civil rights movement. Now, there's some of them who were, but she wasn't. And actually, what happened was that she was going to Spelman. Um, there was a summer, I don't know if it was her sophomore year or something like that. She was working at Spelman with a summer job. And there's a organization, I'm blanking on the name. It's a sort of a Black woman's health organization that was being established about that time. And they came to Spelman to organize. They had a big conference at Spelman and they organized around women's health issues and women's rights and how they needed to, how they could advocate for their health. And she went to that conference and she was so excited about it that she didn't go to work. She she just went to the conference because she couldn't pull herself away from it. And at that point, after she went to that conference, she decided that she wanted to be involved with a women's health group. So there was a women's health group in the city of Atlanta, and she went to that group and asked to volunteer. And so the group was doing a number of different things, including um, well, if you remember, early on at that time, there was a movement to stop abortion. I mean, that seems to have been going on for since Roe v. Wade. But the anti-abortion group came to Atlanta for one of their national conferences. And they trained people in Atlanta to go and stand in front of Planned Parenthood and all places like that to to keep people from going in,
Uh,
to
uh,
get abortions and all of that kind of stuff. So the group that she was working for, volunteering at, was under siege. And, because people were standing around, and, going after the people that were coming in there for whatever reason. They didn't know. They just wanted them not to go in there at all, regardless of whether they were getting an abortion or picking up you
mm,
know, some birth control pills. It didn't matter. So one of the things they had been engaged with was working with the gay men's movement in Atlanta to uh, work with the CDC,
mm,
and to figure out what they should do. Because you remember there was a time when gay men were dropping left and right, because of AIDS, and they didn't have a cure. They didn't know what it was to begin with, and all of that kind of stuff. And so they had asked the women's group to work with them as they fought with the CDC. So as this other stuff happened, they had to let that go. Meanwhile, uh, Days On had been working with Black women who were presenting, to the gay men's group, or going to them and asking for help about what to do about AIDS. And the women's group decided that they couldn't support that anymore. You had to focus on the other thing. The gay men thought, well, that's not who we are. And so these Black women were left out in the cold. And that's when she, got together with them and sat down, and then they came up with this program that's been running for probably 30 years now.
mhm, mhm.
I don't know if that
Excellent.
gets to.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that might have covered the tidbit that we wanted to be able to provide. So thank you. Thank you very much about that.
Mhm.
Dr. James,
Mhm.
you talked a little bit about what gave you the inspiration for this book. Um, I want you to kind of stretch beyond that and just tell us what inspired you to write. What It's a discipline in and of itself.
Yeah,
So
it
tell me
is.
about
I'm not, I have a daughter who is a writer, among other things. And I'll tell this quick story about her. She would not learn to read when she was in first grade. She was like, she didn't see the need for it, because she said, and I said, she never did anything like anybody else. She said she didn't need to read because I read everything she wanted to hear anyway. So why should she read? Well, since I was reading to her, I'm like, I don't think that's what they meant when they told us to read to our children. I don't think
that.
that was the response. So, at any rate, she goes to first grade and she's just recalcitrant. I'm not learning. There's no point to it. Why should I bother? And all of this kind of stuff. So she wasn't the only one. And to the teacher's credit, she threw away the books of Dick and Jane. I don't know if you remember Dick and Jane and how boring they were, but the kids were like, falling out asleep.
Mhm.
Said, okay, we have to do something else. So she went home and made these little booklets and put that little paper, in it. And she said, since you don't want to read Dick and Jane, you have to write your own books. And
Oh,
my daughter comes home with this little thing and she says, Mom, I'm gonna be an author. So
yeah.
I'm like, well, that's nice, but you can't be an author unless you know how to read. And she said, oh, and the little turkey learned to read. Just like once she found out, and she's been writing ever since,
Yeah.
literally. She really did want to write, and she just continues to write, and produce books.
Mhm.
But I don't know where I was going with that.
It was your entree to telling us why you
Okay,
write.
so I'm telling you, this is how she wanted to write.
Uh-huh.
That was not me. That is not my story. My thing about writing is that I I write if it's something that is happening that I feel like is a human wrong. or if people are not getting what they need. For example, I spent a lot of time working on female genital cutting, and I have an anthology that I work with from somebody else with a co-editor. And the point was, first of all, uh, learning about female genital cutting was just, at the time, shocking. And I remember I was in grad school at the time, and I think that Alice Walker had written Warrior Marks, and she did a documentary. She and Fatima Parma did a documentary about it. My mother saw Alice Walker on Oprah talking about this issue. Now, my mother calls me up and she's like incensed.
Mm,
Do you know about this?
mhm,
I said, well, yes, I've heard about it. She says, you need to stop it. And I'm like, me? She said it like I could just go over to Africa and tell people to stop and that would happen, you know. So what I noticed is that we in the Western world were we were being told, or the feminists in the Western world were outraged
mm,
about this. And they were busy going over to Africa and telling the African women that they were barbaric and uncivilized and they need to stop doing this and so forth and so on. And it really was bad, particularly the white feminists that were going over there and doing this. And I was active in the African Studies Association at that time, and we had um, the Women's Caucus had meetings around this. And I will never forget that one African woman stood up and she said she just hated what we were doing because it made her feel like that she was just one big genitalia walking around, and that's how people thought of her in this country and in the West. And I thought, oh my God, you
mm,
know, that that was just awful to
mhm,
me. And I thought, I have to write about this. I have to talk about it in a way that addresses uh, Western feminist, because them walking around saying you have to stop this and you're barbaric is not helpful. It
mhm,
does not make a difference. Um, and that they needed to, first of all, know what they were talking about. Most of them didn't know the, the variations of it. They didn't know where what was practiced, because different practices are in different places. They didn't know what age it was happening. I mean, sometimes it's done to babies. Sometimes it's a part of the transition into womanhood. So it's at 13 or 14. Sometimes it's done when you marry, before you get married. So I mean, there's all kinds of cultural reasons that are culturally specific. This is not to say that I am for it. I'm not. But what I'm saying is that if you want to address it,
mhm,
you have to follow the lead of the people within the country, the women and sometimes men who have decided that this is something that they shouldn't be doing, because then it becomes culture specific, and then they talk to people, or they know how to talk to their people, and what to say to them to bring about these changes. So I knew I had to write or work with people to write about telling Western women to back off and to think differently about how they were going to address this issue. Not that it wasn't an important issue, but that you have to respect the people who lived in the culture to be able to define or describe or put together appropriate responses to actually make a difference in that particular thing. So things like that come to me, and then that's when I am ready to write, you know. But I don't just sit down and start writing.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a hard discipline.
It is.
You got
Mhm.
to really be intentional, and it's not just 5 minutes and then you walk off for the next 3 months and come back and do another
Exactly.
5 minutes.
Mhm.
You know, it takes quite a deal and quite a big effort. When we started off, you mentioned the backstory for Rosa Parks and
Mhm.
how the presentation of her in the media and all we've had in the beginning was just, tired feet, right?
Mhm.
And so I celebrate that recognition. There's been a lot of effort made across this nation to sort of erase Black history or rewrite Black history. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what impact is that going to have on younger generations? And what do we need to do about it now
Mhm.
so that the story remains complete and whole?
I think that I grew up in Iowa. I was born and raised in Iowa, which is unusual, and I'm a fourth generation Iowan, Black Iowan. So they weren't talking about Black folks in my school, okay, because there weren't that many of us there. So I was in a sense bored with the reading and so forth and so on. And my mother found books about, you know, Black people that she thought I would like, second, third, fourth grade, whatever. And I was reading those at home, you know, because that's what, she wanted me to be, know who I was and where I came from. And I don't know that there was a whole lot of that then, because that's a long time ago. But she diligently went about finding that. And that's how I got into it. Now, I think that, I know in Madison, Wisconsin, when I was there, the Black folks got together and established their own Saturday school
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
where they taught their kids about their history. And this was because the public school system was not addressing their needs in the way that they thought it should be done. So they were very concerned and they came together and did their own. There were people all over this country that were doing it. That's what the Black Panthers were doing,
yep.
for example, in the 60s. So I think we have to become involved in that. This is the 21st century, which means that the kids they're online
Mhm,
much more than we are. So we have to get younger people in who know how to get online and who know how to put together wonderful programs online that are inviting to our kids. And then we have to work with that as well as the in-person things. But
mhm.
I mean, we just have to be creative with it because we cannot allow them to hijack our history again. And
Yeah.
especially since scholars have spent, decades um, pulling it up, finding it, and getting it out to us.
Mhm. Dr. James, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for introducing us to your extraordinary work. We now have new Black History Month and Women Histories Month, new material. We now can talk to our younger generations and one another about some fantastic leaders that are up and coming, right? And maybe just a little bit younger than we are in some cases. Is
One,
there a question? I was checking the chat box. I did not see any questions in the chat or comments in the chat box as we get closer to closing our time together.
I
Um,
want to address the social justice warrior.
ah, yes,
Yeah.
please, please.
Um, she asked me, before I came on about using the term social justice warrior. And so in, typical academic fashion, I looked it up because I wanted to make sure I was dealing, going to say the right things about it. Because these women are social justice warriors, that's for sure. But I discovered when I looked it up that it is being demonized. That terminology, being a social justice warrior, is being demonized in the way that DEI is being demonized now. Okay. They're like, oh, it's like, or like the way that they demonize being a progressive, or being liberal or that kind of thing. So I was thinking about what it meant, and it means that you're, an advocate, that you're passionate about justice, and you want to make sure that people have access to it, and a lot of things like that. But I think, especially for this group, one of the things that I would like to present to you to think about is in the way I look at it, the first social justice warrior was Jesus Christ.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ went into, to the, okay, let me back up. Let's just think about the things that Jesus Christ has done or did in his time. He had supper with people who were tax collectors. He chastised Martha because she was mad that Mary was coming in to sit at his feet to learn rather than helping her prepare the meal. Okay. He overturned the tables outside of the synagogue, or in the synagogue, because they were, doing things with, money that he didn't think should happen in his father's house. You know, all of those things were, he cured lepers, you know, he cured other people. He talked to people as if they were human beings, and he treated them like they were human beings. So to me, I think that's a social justice warrior. And I feel that if we want to work in that way and make a difference in that way, we already know who it is that set the standard for us.
And amen very much. Dr. James, could you please hold up that book one more time and slowly tell us what the title is?
Okay. Okay. Can you see it? I don't know if you can you see it?
I can see it. Whoever has that question, is everybody able to capture the title? Practical
I'll tell you.
Audacity, Black
Practical, I
Women
guess. Yeah.
and International Human Rights.
Black women and international human rights.
Yeah, I was
The
trying to type
subtitle.
it in there so people could get it.
Mhm.
Um, International Human Rights. And Google, it's available at Amazon, it's available in a number of places. So
Yeah, I was
international.
gonna say I'm not sure if we supposed to be are we supposed to be boycotting Amazon?
Well, a number of places. Like I saw
Okay.
it on eBay, I saw it on, so just Google
Yeah,
and
okay.
everything. Okay. All right. A
And it's
reminder.
University of Wisconsin Press,
Mhm.
also.
Okay. 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 And do we have another one in the works? Dr. James, I know you retired, but I'm just saying, but
You know what? My mother told me before she passed that she wanted me to write her story.
oh,
And she was a writer, she kept uh, you know, I got a whole box full of her sort of diaries about her life. And so I'm trying to read through the diaries and think about how would I do this. And then as I thought about it, it became clear to me that, she was born and raised in Des Moines. Her mother was born and raised in Des Moines. And what we hear, the stories that we hear about when people are telling their stories, mostly it's about Black people in the South. Okay. It's not, we don't really hear about what our stories are for those of us who were born and raised, for example, in the Midwest, you know, and what kind, and, Iowa is very proud to say that they never had slavery and that, you know, uh, uh, they never had, uh, you know, uh, legalized segregation. But it doesn't mean that, they didn't, there wasn't racism or they didn't practice de facto segregation. So as I started reading my mother's stuff, it became clear to me that I was going to have to tell the story of Iowa, you know, and what it was like then to grow up in situations like this and where Black people went and how we got there. How did we get to Iowa? And I know, for example, a lot of people came from Missouri to escape slavery, But anyway, I just feel like her story is important, but it's also important to have that background
Mm-hmm.
as well. So, I mean, I don't know when that is, you know.
Well, we'll all be waiting because we've become fast fans. So thank you so much. Thank you. Everyone who's present, just wanted to also wait for thanking you. Dr. James, honestly, it's such a gift with you sending your name and saying, I've got a book, would you consider it? Not enough of us do that. I'm glad that you did. I look forward to getting information from your daughter so we can hear about her book and see her also on this program we're talking now. So thank you very much. I appreciate your being here, as well as
Thank
all
you.
those who are in attendance. Folks, this is March. Yeah. I'm reminding everyone we're going to be taking a break in April because the second and the third fall on between Palm Sunday and Easter.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that would make it difficult, I think, for most of us to participate. So we'll be back in May and let you know somewhere along the way what the topics are going to be for that as we get closer. So thank you again. Thank the leadership present and past that are present with us today for being foundational rocks to the organization. And pray God's best blessings upon you as we continue in our journey towards the cross with Jesus. Thank you very much. Let us go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks
Thanks be
be
to
to
God.
God.